Hey everybody, welcome back to Kayfabe Critique. I'm David.
I'm Jason. What's up?
And so we're about to dig into probably the most famous and most notorious group in the history of professional wrestling.
Yes.
Arguably the biggest storyline in the history of wrestling.
Arguably, yes.
Definitely a storyline that changed the face of wrestling and kind of ushered in a new era.
Got me hooked back in for sure.
And so, of course, I mentioned before I wasn't watching during when this started, but when I got into watching and I ended up tuning in to figure out what was going on, going back and catching up on this. But this storyline was so big that prior to the Attitude Era, this was the first time in my life I remember seeing wrestling shirts out in public. And more importantly, adults wearing wrestling shirts.
Right. Because this was the first time you really had wrestling shirts that weren't hyper colored and looked cartoonish.
And so, what we're talking about, of course, is the NWO. The New World Order. Something that lit WCW on fire and started the 83-week winning streak in the Monday Night Wars.
Shout out to Eric Bischoff and Conrad Thompson.
Yeah, and so when you think about what was going on at the time, what really set the stage for the NWO, you had the territory days.
Mm-hmm.
You have, Vincent K. McMahon come in and have the vision of doing a national program instead of just the local regional issue.
Right.
And seeing cable television as the breakthrough to be able to go in and showcase his product and to be able to get advertisers and sponsors involved, which nobody had been able to do in wrestling before.
Right.
And he did it, and he did it successfully, and he created these amazing characters, these larger-than-life superheroes, and created a marketing machine, and talking about t-shirts and posters and lunchboxes and action figures, arcade games, etc. that we hadn't really seen before in wrestling, and he truly made it mainstream, like WrestleMania and the involvement of MTV. And did most of this with the rise of Hulkamania, with Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, in the 80s, you talk about 80s wrestling, the first name that's going to pop up for most people is Hulk Hogan. Not because Ric Flair wasn't doing his thing, but because the WWF was just such a national juggernaut. Hulk Hogan was on the A-Team. Hulk Hogan's on, The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. He's doing videos with Dolly Parton. Hulk Hogan is basically everywhere.
Right, and, even Hogan himself will acknowledge that when you go head-to-head at that time, Flair's the better wrestler.
Without a doubt.
But Hogan was the bigger character, and Hogan had the marketing power of Vince McMahon and the WWF at the time behind him. Where Flair was involved in the NWA, and that promotion was really ran still like a local regional promotion.
It was ran like a regional promotion, and it was also more just it was more of a southern-based thing, and it was more geared towards adult males, which the WWF was geared towards. Their programming was geared towards kids. Yeah. You didn't see a lot. You saw some, but you didn't see a lot of the bloodbaths that the matches where everybody's bleeding all over the place. You would see in WCW. You didn't see a lot of that. You didn't see a lot of blood, but WCW. They were more geared towards your southern crowd. They started to go national a little bit, but they really kind of stayed in a little territory, like you were saying.
Yeah, and the Jim Crockett Promotions, it was really. It was more sport, where WWE was more entertainment.
Exactly.
And so then you have, during this time, Ted Turner billionaire Ted Turner throws his money into the ring. He buys Jim Crockett Promotions.
Right.
And creates World Championship Wrestling.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another important thing to look at during this time was one of the other rival organizations early on is the AWA.
Mm-hmm.
That's where a lot of the big WWF superstars came from, was
Mm-hmm.
AWA. And in the AWA, you had an announcer, Eric Bischoff.
Right.
And as the AWA is kind of folding, going under, just can't compete with the WWF, which most places did go under during that time, he finds himself going to work for WCW.
Mm-hmm.
And initially he comes in to work for WCW as an announcer, and then eventually steps into the role of executive producer, and then eventually becomes the president of WCW.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about a fast rise for a young guy.
Yeah, I mean, he rose fast, and I just think that they were looking to kind of rebrand themselves, because if you watch, I mean, if you go on the WWE Network and watch some old WCW shows, and you look as the production value evolved as Eric Bischoff started to take over the company. I mean, like the old Saturday night show, I mean, it was filmed on like a stage where, I mean, you could fit fans in there, but it was basically the same spot every week. But as Bischoff comes in, he starts to ramp up like the lighting. He likes to, I mean, he's ramping everything up. I mean, as we see here, he eventually has the idea for Monday Nitro.
Yeah, and so like you were saying, he definitely had a producer's thought from a television standpoint, not really a wrestling standpoint, which made him different, which made him be able to bring a different level of quality to the product that previously wasn't there.
Mm-hmm.
Where, WWE has always been about the production and the show.
Mm-hmm.
WCW really hadn't until Eric Bischoff got there.
Right. I mean, WCW had been about the wrestling,
Mm-hmm.
which, I mean, nothing wrong with that, but Bischoff saw it as a television product because, I mean, people are watching you on television, you're trying to sell ads, you're trying to sell things like that, so you're trying to sell a television product. And the old WCW television product, I mean, the wrestling was great, but the rest of the presentation was lacking.
And so meanwhile, on the other channel, Hulk Hogan is kind of running his course. The WWE crowd is kind of, you still have younger Hulkamaniacs coming in, but you have a lot of the older fans that are tuning away, and a lot of people are kind of getting tired of Hogan, and Hogan starts kind of getting booed in the WWE.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, I was actually watching the '92 Royal Rumble match, where it's one of like I don't know, it wasn't a hidden gem or anything like that, but I was just watching that the other night, and the way that the crowd was reacting towards Sid and against Hogan at the end of that Rumble where Flair won the WWF title, I mean, it was definitely noticeable. And then you also had the whole steroid thing that came down, which didn't help him at all when he went on the Arsenio Hall show and, had that debacle.
Yeah, and so Hogan steps away from the WWE. But WWE continues to try to move into a direction that's similar to what they've been running in the 80s, just without Hogan.
Mm-hmm.
But they try to give it a 90s flair, and they go with more brighter colors.
Mm-hmm.
And truly, which you can go back and look through our archives from season 1 on YouTube and look at not only the golden era, which we kind of just high-leveled, walked over, but as well as the new generation for what we're talking about right now. And it was really WWE still kind of trying to move in that direction of what they had done in the 80s, but the crowd's just kind of it's running its course.
Mm-hmm.
They really need something different. So Eric Bischoff is starting to try to think of how to do stuff different, but what he's also doing is he's trying to right the ship. And so he's looking at cutting expenses, changing the television product, and he starts trying to look at what can draw attention there, and he signs Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, he signs Hulk Hogan because he was still, made the biggest name in wrestling at that time. I mean, granted, WCW still had Ric Flair, they had Sting, but Hulk Hogan was still like, you talk about professional wrestling, I mean, first name that's gonna come to mind is Hulk Hogan. I mean, a lot of people like that aren't diehard wrestling fans don't know who Ric Flair is, which I mean is unfortunate for them, but people know the name Hulk Hogan.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Bischoff brings him in, which is a good move. It brings attention and gives even Vince McMahon acknowledged that it gave WCW credibility.
Without a doubt.
And so you bring Hogan in, and that's followed by Hogan helped open the door to get other people in there, such as Savage. And so now Bischoff's getting some of the biggest names in wrestling to go along with Ric Flair, and he's kind of building his roster. But you quickly run into the same thing where we were talking about the new generation, where the crowd was kind of sick of that platform. You run into the same thing to where the crowd starts to boo Hogan about a year into his WCW run.
Right, they start to boo him, and also when you look at the storylines that they were doing with like the Dungeon of Doom, and the fact that you've got, I mean, John Tenta, rest in peace, was dressed as a shark. He had a like face paint. It was a shark, and the fact that he headlined Starrcade, which is like the granddaddy of them all, in 1994. Think about 1993 Starrcade. You have Ric Flair versus Vader, and like I think it was What Happened When they did that episode. They did an episode on that. They broke down this whole storyline phenomenally with Flair versus Vader. And then you go to 94. You've got Hulk Hogan against Brutus, the effing Barber Beefcake, as Conrad would say, as the Zodiac in your main event.
Yeah, and so it definitely was showing the crowd was wanting something else. That these over-the-top, almost comical caricatures in a way, had ran its course. And so Bischoff's looking to do something different, and he does two different things here. On one, within a conversation with Ted Turner, not expecting it, Ted Turner asked him how to compete, so he throws out, "Give me prime time." And so he ends up getting 2 hours on the flagship channel, TNT, every Monday night to go head-to-head with Raw.
All right, and this is September of 1995 when this happens, and I remember watching that first episode. I wasn't really watching WWF at the time, but it's September, football season hasn't started yet. So I hear about this WCW Monday Nitro thing, and Hulk Hogan still was a name that I recognized, and so I tuned into it. This is kind of cool.
And so he launches Nitro, and the Monday Night Wars are on. And so during this time, the Monday Night Wars have now started. WWE is still, in the new generation era. Eric Bischoff takes a trip to Japan, and in that trip to Japan, he's looking at the presentation of their product. How do they get their people loyal? And through this time, and while he's in Japan, he's starting to think of a reality-based storyline. And really, that seed in his mind is starting to form, and we know that will end up becoming the NWO.
Right, and I think it's important to think about where the world is in this time frame of 1995 to 1996, which we might wait a little bit to go into the next episode, but just reality-based is where things were going at that time. People really didn't want the cartoonish, sensationalized stuff. I think this is around, I don't know if this is around the time when the Real World started on MTV, but stuff like that was starting to catch on.
Alright, so we're going to pause right there. You can always come back and find the later editions of the NWO. If not, if you just keep it going, you'll see that in a moment as we'll continue with our NWO coverage talking about the beginning and the rise of the New World Order.
I need to get the big gold belt.